The morning the HOA stepped onto my vineyard, the air was still heavy with fog, the kind that drifts low between the rows, clinging to the vines like a quiet warning. The world was muted, peaceful, almost sacred. It's the hour when the land breathes before the sun fully rises, when the grapes are cool to the touch, and the soil smells like dew and memory. It's a moment my family has cherished for nearly a century. That's why the sound of footsteps didn't make sense at first. Not soft, familiar footsteps. Not the shuffle of my own boots on loose gravel, but heavy, deliberate steps, two sets, crunching across the soil like they owned it. I turned the corner near the irrigation shed and froze. Two strangers stood in the middle of my vines, wearing navy jackets with a stark white HOA emblem stitched across the back. Each carried a clipboard. One held a digital camera. They were bent over my young vines like inspectors evaluating a crime scene. For a moment, I thought maybe they were lost hikers, or survey workers, or tourists who wandered too far past the tasting room signs. But then one of them tugged on a vine, hard enough to snap a fragile tendril, and shook his head disapprovingly, scribbling notes like he was grading my family's legacy. The other lifted his camera and snapped a picture of my irrigation control box. Not scenery, not grapes, machinery. Something twisted in my stomach. Then I saw it, a folder tucked under the arm of the taller one, a bright red tab on top, printed in thick, bold letters, HOA violation, unapproved property expansion. My heart thudded once, sharply. A violation? On my land? From an HOA I wasn't even part of? I called out, demanding to know why they were here. They didn't answer. They simply kept walking, deeper into the vines, taking more pictures, jotting more notes, as if I were invisible, as if this land belonged to them. That was the moment the fog didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like an omen. They weren't confused. They weren't lost. They weren't curious. They were inspecting. They were documenting. They were building a case. And the worst part, the part that chilled me more than the cold morning air, was the realization that someone, somewhere in that neighboring HOA, had decided they had authority here. Authority over my vineyard. Authority over land that had been in my family since 1937. Authority they didn't have, and never would. What they didn't know was simple. This vineyard survived droughts, fires, and decades of hardship, and I wasn't about to let it fall to a bored HOA president with a clipboard. They trespassed on the wrong property, and by the time this was over, they would regret ever stepping foot between my vines. Belmere Ridge Vineyard had been in my family for 3 generations, carved into the hillside long before the gated neighborhood below ever existed. The land wasn't just acres of hanging fruit. It was a memory passed through blood. My grandfather used to say the vines had personalities. My father believed they carried the voices of everyone who had tended them. And me? I always felt that if you stood quietly enough at sunrise, you could hear the past breathing through the leaves. On most days, that sense of heritage felt grounding, comforting, a piece of stability in a world that changed far too quickly. I ran the vineyard mostly alone now. My younger sister lived out of state, and after my father passed, she asked me to keep the land alive, to keep the tradition going. I promised her I would, even when drought hit, even when the heat scorched the grapes, even when the economy made selling wine feel like shouting into the wind. My home sat at the highest point of the property, an old farmhouse painted cream, its porch worn smooth by decades of boots. The kitchen still smelled faintly of my grandmother's rosemary bread. The cellar still held my father's old handwritten notes. And behind the house, the vines rolled downward in perfect green waves toward the valley. Just beyond that valley sat the problem. The Silver Oak Trails, HOA, a new, aggressively polished community built only 9 years ago. Sleek homes, manicured lawns, ornamental shrubs cut into shapes that made the houses look identical. Their residents were a different breed from the locals who'd lived here for decades. People who liked control, order, and a sense of authority over everything their eyes landed on. Most HOAs stay within their boundaries. Silver Oak Trails did not. As the neighborhood expanded, property lines became a blurry battlefield. They started to redefine shared access points. They petitioned the county for drainage easement rights. They tried to rename a road that had existed for half a century. And from the moment Diane Mercer became president, their reach only grew bolder. For a long time, I stayed out of it. Their fences weren't anywhere near my vines. Their bylaws didn't affect me. And I had enough on my plate managing harvest seasons, irrigation repairs, and occasional winery tours. But lately, strange things had been happening. Over the past few months, I'd noticed cars idling just a little too close to my property line, people walking dogs along paths that weren't public, a drone buzzing near the fermentation shed, staying long enough to be intentional. I brushed it off as curiosity. Vineyards attract attention. But the morning those trespassing officers stepped between my vines, it clicked. Silver Oak Trails wasn't curious. They were planning something. And if Diane was involved, it wasn't something small. She was the kind of person who used rules like weapons. Former corporate auditor. A woman rumored to have an entire room in her house dedicated to binders. People joked that she slept with the HOA bylaws under her pillow. The first time I encountered her, months before all this, she approached me outside a farmer's market. I had a stall selling our rosé and small batch jams. She walked up with a pen already in hand, introducing herself as if she were running for office. "I live in Silver Oak Trails," she said. "Your vineyard is visible from our Upper Ridge homes." "Good view then," I replied. She didn't laugh. She told me, with pride, that her neighborhood was rapidly growing, and they were exploring ways to integrate with and enhance surrounding land use. I didn't think much of it then. Now I realized she was hinting at something bigger. As word spread about the trespassers, neighbors started telling me little things they'd heard. "Diane's been asking about open land above our ridge. She wants to establish a view preservation zone. I heard they're talking about expanding the HOA borders." The last one stopped me cold. Expanding borders? Onto my land? Even if legally impossible, and it was, Diane didn't seem like the type to care about legality when ambition was involved. That afternoon, I went out walking again, this time paying attention to every footprint, every broken twig, every sign someone had been where they shouldn't. Sure enough, I found fresh boot marks leading along the drainage ditch and another trail near the fence line. I found a stick flagged with bright orange ribbon, the kind used for surveying. Surveying on my property without permission? Something was brewing. But the thing that kept echoing in my mind was the phrase printed on that violation folder: unapproved property expansion. I wasn't expanding anything. I was pruning vines, performing standard seasonal work. Unless... A chill traveled up my spine as a thought hit me. They weren't accusing me of expansion. They were building a justification. Silver Oak Trails was out of space. My vineyard land was valuable, and Diane was the kind of person who believed land should bend to paperwork. I knew then, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a takeover attempt, slow, creeping, bureaucratic, the exact kind of theft that doesn't start with bulldozers, but with clipboards. And the moment those officers stepped between my vines, I knew they'd crossed a line, both legally and personally. But I also knew something they didn't. My land had protections older than their entire community. My boundaries were documented in historical county records. And unlike them, I kept every document. They thought I wouldn't fight, but I had generations of reasons to. Over the next few days, the vineyard felt watched, not in the paranoid sense, not in the way someone feels when working alone at dusk. This was different, intentional, calculated. Every morning, at nearly the same time, I would spot someone from Silver Oak Trails standing just beyond my fence line, phone in hand, pretending to walk their dog or pretending to admire the scenery, but always pointing their camera toward my vines. They rarely stayed long, usually leaving the moment they realized I had seen them. Then came the drone again, not once, but twice in a single week. It hovered over the eastern rows, over the crush pad, over the equipment shed. It was always the same model, with the same flickering green underlight. The first time, I waved a rake at it until it flew off. The second time, I simply recorded it. If they wanted surveillance, I would do some of my own. On the fourth day, something changed. I noticed tire tracks, unfamiliar ones, cutting through the dirt path near the water reservoir. Fresh tracks, deep enough that the soil hadn't settled yet. Someone had driven a small off-road vehicle along the old service trail that no one but my family ever used. Then I saw the flag again. Another bright orange surveyor's ribbon tied to a stick, hammered into the soil just 5 feet from the reservoir line. Not near my border, not near the HOA's boundary, deep inside my vineyard. My jaw tightened so hard it hurt. Surveying my land without permission was illegal, but doing it repeatedly, with officials, with equipment, they weren't just trespassing anymore. They were mapping. But for what? That night, I combed through the Silver Oak Trails HOA website, its archived newsletters, county filings, real estate proposals, and everything I could find, and I discovered it. A proposal, dated 6 months earlier, for future view conservation corridors and long-term boundary revisions pending community vote. And the proposed expansion area? Right across the ridge, right into the vineyard, right into my land. The language was vague enough to sound harmless. Typical HOA jargon, but I knew what it meant. Expanding HOA influence wasn't a suggestion, it was a plan. Diane Mercer was moving the chess pieces long before anyone realized a game was being played. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated how much the vineyard meant to me. The next morning, I drove down to the Silver Oak Trails Community Center. The building was hard to miss. White stucco walls, black tile roof, meticulously trimmed shrubs, a fountain that probably cost more than my entire irrigation system. I walked in, dusty boots and all, drawing side-eyes from residents in tennis attire and pastel sweaters. At the reception desk sat a young woman named Kelly. Polite smile, rigid posture, the kind of employee who knew the scripts and followed them exactly. "Good morning," she chirped. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with your HOA president," I said. Her smile faltered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She blinked, unsure how to handle unscheduled humanity. "I'll see if she's available," she finally said. I watched her walk into an office at the back, heard muffled voices, and then she returned looking strangely relieved. "She'll see you. Third door on the right." I knocked, opened the door, and found Diane sitting behind a polished mahogany desk, surrounded by neatly arranged binders and labeled folders. She didn't stand. She didn't even look surprised. "Ah," she said, "the vineyard owner." "The vineyard owner whose land you keep sending inspectors onto," I replied, taking a seat without being invited. Her lips curved into a tight line, not a smile. More like a signal that she didn't appreciate losing control of the conversation. "We're conducting standard compliance checks," she said. "Compliance for what? I'm not in your HOA. That is still under review." I stared at her. "Under review by who?" "The board." Your board doesn't regulate my land. She tapped her pen against her clipboard. It regulates the land that affects our residents. I almost laughed. Affects? What? The grapes offend your aesthetic? She didn't react. We have received complaints about noise, odors, large equipment, and potential pesticide use near the ridge trail. I leaned forward. Your residents moved in next to an 87-year-old vineyard. If they don't like the smell of grapes, they bought in the wrong neighborhood. Her eyes narrowed. We're finalizing our jurisdiction assessment. My chest tightened. Jurisdiction assessment? Of my land? I stood. Let me make something clear. Your assessments stop at your fence line. My property is documented in county records older than your entire community. Her pen paused mid-tap. And if you trespass again, I continued, you'll deal with more than a complaint. Her eyes flashed. Oh, is that a threat? No, I said calmly. It's a promise. I left before she could respond. But if she felt threatened, she didn't show it. Because the very next morning, things escalated. A thick envelope was taped to my gate. Inside, a preliminary notice of agricultural violations, a demand for a property usage review, a $2,000 preliminary fine, a date for a mandatory compliance hearing, and a printed list titled Regulations for Adjacent Lands. Adjacent lands. My vines. My home. My family legacy. Adjacent to them? The arrogance made my hands shake. Worse, at the bottom of the letter was a threat. In the event of non-compliance, the HOA reserves the right to enter, inspect, and regulate bordering properties. Regulate. They believed they had the legal right to walk onto farmland that hadn't been touched by a regulation in nearly a century. I spent that entire day gathering evidence, historical records, tax documents, deeds signed by my grandfather, boundary maps stamped by the county, correspondence from agricultural boards, permits, aerial photographs, drone footage, and every trespassing photo I had taken over the past week. But paperwork wasn't enough. I needed leverage. So I visited my neighbor Sam, a retired county surveyor who'd lived here longer than I had. He was in his 70s, sharp-eyed, and notoriously allergic to HOA nonsense. When I explained the situation, he didn't ask questions. He grabbed his old metal lockbox from under the bed and handed me something invaluable. Copies of the original county survey from 1937, signed, sealed, and stamped. Then he handed me something even better, a copy of the land use ruling from 1964 establishing the ridge as off-limits to any future residential developments. I stared at the document for nearly a minute before speaking. They don't know this exists, I whispered. No, he said. But they will soon. 2 days later, Diane sent 2 more inspectors, this time taking photos of the winery's delivery access road. When I approached them, they didn't even pretend they had a right to be there. One said, "We're authorized to review adjacent land usage." Authorized by who? I asked. The board. I smiled coldly. You're trespassing. We're performing an assessment. You're performing a crime. They left, but not before snapping several final photos. The following morning, I attended the mandatory compliance hearing at the Silver Oak Trails Clubhouse. The room was set up like a courtroom, a long table for the board, chairs for the residents, a podium for the defendant. Me. I walked up to the podium slowly, calmly, not because I wasn't angry, but because I wanted every board member to see that I wasn't afraid. They were expecting a farmer with no fight in him. Instead, they got a man carrying a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. Diane began reading off a list of fabricated violations: unauthorized agricultural expansion, unapproved fencing repairs, drainage alteration affecting community property, potential encroachment. Encroachment. Onto my own land. She continued reading, one false charge after another, until residents in the chairs behind her began shifting uncomfortably. Then she said what I had been waiting for. As a result of these findings, the HOA may pursue regulatory authority over the ridge border and adjacent land. My land, I let her finish. Then I opened my binder, slowly, deliberately, and the entire room leaned in. The room was silent when I opened the binder. Not the polite kind of silence you hear in meetings, but the heavy kind. The kind that forms when people sense something big is about to happen. Diane watched me with a tight, anticipatory smile, the smile of someone who expected to win before the fight even started. Her board members sat stiffly beside her, hands folded, eyes down, clearly coached to stay quiet, and behind them, the residents, dozens of them, leaned forward in their metal chairs, as if the next few minutes would determine the direction of their entire neighborhood. I laid the first document on the table. This, I said calmly, is the original deed to Belmere Ridge Vineyard, signed in 1937, stamped by the county. It establishes my family's land boundaries, boundaries that have not changed in 87 years. Diane didn't blink. I set down the second document. This is the 1964 land use ruling. It declares the ridge line and the slopes above it as protected agricultural territory, permanently off limits to any future residential or HOA development. A murmur rippled across the audience. A board member shifted in his chair. But I wasn't done. I placed an aerial map on the table, printed in full color, recent, accurate. This is the current county GIS map. As you can see, the nearest point of your HOA jurisdiction line stops 612 feet short of my vineyard, with the ridge acting as a natural and legal barrier. Diane's jaw tightened. Her pen froze mid-tap. I looked up and spoke louder, letting my voice carry through the room. Therefore, any attempt by this HOA to regulate, inspect, fine, or assess my land is not only illegitimate, it is illegal. Another ripple moved through the crowd, louder this time. Several residents whispered to each other. One man shook his head in disbelief. A woman leaned to her friend and muttered, "We don't have that kind of authority." I raised my hand to quiet the murmurs. But let's talk about authority. I slid forward a USB drive. On this drive is footage from multiple cameras across my property, cameras that recorded your hired inspectors trespassing on my land 6 times in the last 11 days. Diane blinked far too slowly. I continued. Here is drone footage, my drone footage, showing your HOA drone hovering above restricted farmland and capturing private agricultural operations without permission. Gasps. I placed another document on the table. And this is a notarized statement from a retired county surveyor verifying the location of the original property markers, including one that predates the founding of your entire neighborhood by nearly 70 years. One of the board members whispered, "Oh my God." Diane's hands curled around her clipboard like she was trying to crush it. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the biggest stack yet, a thick folder of photos. "These," I said, flipping them out like cards in a magic trick, "are images of your employees placing survey stakes inside my vineyard. Here are your inspectors taking pictures of my irrigation system. Here are your people walking between my vines. And here," I tossed a photo onto the table, "is a shot of your inspectors nearly damaging a young vine by pulling it without permission." I let the photos sit there, spread across the table like evidence at a trial. The room buzzed. Diane tried to speak, but her voice cracked before the words formed. I cut her off. "Now let's discuss the document you taped to my gate." I lifted the fake violation notice and held it up for everyone to see. This letter claims I must attend a mandatory compliance review for agricultural violations. But according to County Statute 8.14, only the County Agricultural Board has that authority, not an HOA. And according to Statute 5.03, HOAs that knowingly misrepresent their jurisdiction can face civil penalties. Now the audience was fully awake. Residents turned to each other, whispering, "We never voted on any of this." Is she allowed to do that? She sent people onto farmland? I thought HOAs couldn't cross their borders. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably. I slowly placed one last document onto the table, a printed email, an email from Diane, and it was the nail in the coffin. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is an internal HOA communication, forwarded anonymously, where Ms. Mercer discusses evaluating possibilities for extending HOA influence onto adjacent vineyard land for long-term development." Diane went white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. One board member stared at the email, horrified. You never told us this." Another whispered, "We can't expand onto agricultural land. That's illegal." A resident in the back stood up and said loudly, "Wait, she was trying to take over the vineyard? For what?" For the first time, Diane lost her composure. "That email was, it's being taken out of context," she snapped. "We were exploring options." "Illegal options," I replied. It was hypothetical. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Then why did you send inspectors onto my property? Why did you survey my vines? Why did you fine me for unapproved agricultural activity? Why did you claim jurisdiction you do not have?" Her lip trembled. The room was dead silent. I took my time placing the final piece of evidence on the table, a formal letter, signed by a county attorney, stating that the HOA had no legal authority over my vineyard, all trespassing incidents were actionable, any further attempts would result in criminal charges, and that the county recommended an internal investigation of the HOA's leadership. One of the board members inhaled sharply. Another dropped his pen. Diane's face contorted, fury, fear, panic, all fighting to surface. "You," she began, voice cracking. "You can't bring the county into this." I straightened. "I already did." The room erupted. Residents stood. Board members whispered frantically. Someone demanded to know why they weren't informed of any boundary expansion proposal. Another said they wanted an emergency vote. Someone shouted, "You lied to us, Diane." But the board chair, an older man who had barely spoken all meeting, finally stood up. He looked at me, then at the stack of evidence, then at Diane. "Ms. Mercer, we need to speak privately." "No," she snapped. "This is being blown out of proportion. He's exaggerating." The board chair shook his head. "No, he isn't." Within minutes, the board excused themselves and asked Diane to step outside. She refused at first, but eventually stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her so hard the windows rattled. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then the board returned, without Diane. The chair cleared his throat and faced the residents. "Effective immediately," he said, voice heavy. "Ms. Mercer is removed as HOA president pending further investigation." Gasps, cheers. A few people clapped. One woman actually sighed in relief. The chair turned back to me. "We apologize," he said quietly. "This never should have happened." I nodded once, silently, because honestly, my actions had said everything that needed to be said. When I left the HOA clubhouse that evening, the sun was already dipping behind the ridge, casting long, soft shadows across the valley, the kind of evening glow my father used to call grape light, the golden hour when the vineyard looked almost unreal, every vine shimmering, every leaf outlined like it was drawn by hand. I stood there for a long moment, breathing the warm air, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Quiet. Steady. Earned relief. The board's decision to remove Diane wasn't just a symbolic victory. It meant the entire foundation of her overreach had cracked. Without her pushing the narrative, the fabricated violations, the trespassing inspectors, the bogus surveying, all of it fell apart within days. 2 mornings after the hearing, an official county vehicle pulled up to the gate. A representative stepped out, shook my hand firmly, and issued a written statement confirming what I already knew. My vineyard was legally protected agricultural land. The HOA had zero authority over it. Any future trespass would be treated as a criminal offense, and the county would be conducting its own inquiry into the HOA's actions. He handed me his card and said, "If anyone steps foot on your land again, call me directly." For the first time in weeks, I slept easily. But the true aftermath unfolded more slowly and more beautifully than I expected. Within a week, multiple residents from Silver Oak Trails drove up to the vineyard to apologize. Not scripted apologies, real ones. They parked at the gate, walked up nervously, and said things like, "I didn't know she was doing all that. We trusted her, and she took advantage of it. She made it sound like you were expanding illegally. We're embarrassed, truly." One couple brought a basket of pastries. A retired woman brought fresh-cut flowers. A young father brought a bottle of his favorite bourbon saying, "Seems like you could use a drink after this month." But the moment that hit me hardest wasn't the apologies. It was what they confessed. Many residents had been afraid of Diane, afraid of questioning her decisions, afraid of opposing her initiatives, afraid of penalties, fines, retaliation. She had turned their HOA into a mechanism of fear, and they hadn't even realized how deeply it had seeped into their daily lives. The board, shaken by the hearing, called an emergency community vote. Several new members were elected, people who were tired of the power games, people who genuinely wanted to rebuild trust. They reached out to me personally, asking if I would consult with them on boundary education, so nothing like this ever happened again. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because my grandfather always said, "Land isn't just dirt, it's relationship," and relationships needed repairing. The new board drafted a formal agreement clarifying the ridge's protected status and publicly apologized at the next HOA meeting. They revoked every false notice Diane had issued, notified the county of the rogue actions, and implemented a policy requiring resident approval for any future land-related initiatives. But the fallout for Diane? That was something else entirely. The county investigation found multiple violations, from unauthorized surveying to misrepresentation of jurisdictional authority. She faced fines, potential civil charges, and was permanently banned from holding any position within the HOA again. Word spread quickly through the valley. Her reputation crumbled. Many residents she once controlled with fear now openly criticized her. But I didn't celebrate her downfall. I didn't have to. The land had taken care of it. Because here's the truth about farmland, especially a place like Belmere Ridge. You don't hold on to land for 87 years by being passive. You don't survive droughts, fires, floods, and recessions by rolling over. And you sure as hell don't let someone with a clipboard take what generations before you fought to preserve. But the real impact wasn't just on the HOA. It was on me. The experience reminded me of something my father once said as we walked the rows at sunset. A vineyard teaches you patience, and it teaches you when to stand your ground. He was right. And standing my ground became more than defending acres and boundaries. It became a reminder of who I was, of the legacy I carried, of the responsibility I held. A few weeks later, I found myself back at the ridge at sunrise, the same spot where this whole mess began. The fog was lighter that morning, rolling between the rows like a quiet prayer. That familiar peace returned, stronger than ever. The land felt safe again, whole again, mine again. But it was what happened next that surprised me most. One of the new HOA board members approached me, hat in hand, and asked if I might consider hosting a small vineyard tour for the community, not as an obligation, but as a gesture of goodwill. At first, I wanted to decline. Then I changed my mind. Because if the vineyard was going to continue for another generation, it needed to be part of the community, not threatened by it. So I agreed. The tour was small and simple, nothing fancy. I showed them the vines, explained the pruning, the irrigation, the harvest cycles. I told them how my grandfather planted the first rows and how my father grafted new ones decades later. I talked about family and tradition and the love poured into these hills. And I watched something beautiful happen. Understanding, respect, connection. Not one of those residents looked at the vineyard the way Diane had tried to teach them to. Not as an obstacle, not as leverage, not as something to control. They saw it the way my family always had, as a piece of living history. Before they left, one of the older residents shook my hand and said, "We're glad it's you who owns this place." And for once, I didn't feel like a man defending land. I felt like a part of something bigger, something older, something worth protecting, not just for me, but for everyone who lived around it. HOA power, intimidation, bureaucracy, none of it compared to the strength of a community finally waking up to the truth. Some boundaries exist for a reason, and the moment you try to cross them, you find out exactly why they were never meant to be moved.